If you're going to argue with something that's wrong with the world, to what are you going to appeal in order to support that contention? Well, what are you going to appeal to? Hello again everyone, Triggerman 1976 here. Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we'll be looking at part of a panel discussion that took place about a year ago now on the Deep Drinks podcast with its host, David McDonald. We're going to be looking at a section of the discussion that begins about 30 minutes or so into the podcast. And as you can tell by the title of this video, it is probably going to get spicy. But before we get into the video itself, I do have a special request, and that comes in the face of if you like what I'm doing here and you would like to support me. Number one, I don't have a Patreon. Number two, I'm not monetized. But what you can do to support me and what I'm doing is to go out to Amazon and pick up a copy of my debut novel. Let me get it in frame here. My debut novel, The Turning of Shadow. It's pretty thick. It's action adventure, action thriller. If you want to support me, if you want to help me out, if you're just looking to read something that's good, at least everybody who's read it so far thinks it's really good. You can go out to Amazon. Of course, links will be in the description. And of course, all links will be in the description below. That being said, the first question when it comes to this video, when it comes to the subject I'll be responding to, when it comes to the people I'll be responding to, there's probably going to be a question. Triggerman, what makes you think you're qualified to interact with these individuals, all of whom have PhDs, they're accomplished, they're published? So what makes you think you're qualified? First of all, I would like to say that your level of educational achievement doesn't determine whether or not your argument is sound. Second, why should we assume that just because they say something under the cover of scholarly authority that what they're saying is true or accurate? Could it be true? Could it be accurate? That's something we'll determine as we go forward. Now, I'm not saying that anyone has to take my word for granted on this. However, rather often, PhDs will. My interests are theological, but they're also anthropological. They're historical. They're philosophical. My critique here is of their presentations in the video. Now, I could respond to the entire discussion, and believe me, there's a lot to respond to. But I believe that this section is indicative of both the quality of the arguments in general and what is not being said by these people. And I will further preface this by saying the discussion is about a rather sensitive subject and will be discussed frankly and forthrightly from this point forward. That being said, let's get into the video. Let's listen to what they have to say. Try to be very fair here, and I hope that comes across. But let's get into it.
For me, I was quite shocked to see sex slavery in there. I don't know if I really absorbed that concept until I kind of saw it written out in your slides. Can you go into a little bit more detail into what that is? Like, what is sexual slavery?
Yeah, I mean, I think before I do, one of the things that we need to make sure that we do in this type of a discussion is to distinguish between what they considered to be X and what we would consider to be X. And this sort of gets problematic in apologetic discussions because when we talk about something like rape, it's very clear that many laws in the ancient world, including the Hebrew Bible, would endorse something that we today would consider to be rape. However, those same legal sections, they might not have viewed and often did not view that particular action under the category of rape, right? And so what you often have...
First of all, I'm happy that Dr. Bowen is willing to make a distinction between what an ancient person would describe as an immoral behavior and what we describe as such. Now, if there's one place where I would deviate, it's that he believes that ancient laws were prescriptive. They're intended to endorse behavior. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of law in general, or specifically law codes in the ancient world. As John Walton has noted in his book, The Lost World of the Torah, Walton writes, ancient codes are not the laws of the land, they are not legislative decrees, and they do not constitute a prescriptive code enforced in society. These lists of legal sayings do not tell us what laws were enforced in society, much like proverbs do not tell us how everyone lived their lives in society. Both sorts of corpus are illustrations compiled to communicate the wisdom that will lead to order and justice. Walton goes on further to note that the general consensus regarding ancient law codes is that they are intended to represent model verdicts. This is because ancient judges issue their verdicts largely based on established customs and received wisdom rather than on prescriptive statutes. So, right off the bat, we have something of a failure. So, while it's true for Bowen to point out that ancient culture wouldn't necessarily consider some action to be immoral, he fails to identify a specific understanding of how an ancient would have understood law in general, and that is in specific regard to a specific cultural context. And it's subsequently how we are to understand biblical law codes and what they represent. Now, we'll probably touch more on this as we go along, but there's some more of the video that we need to be looking at.
Under the category of rape, right? And so what you often have happening here is an apologist will say, no, rape is not endorsed or rape is not allowed or condoned in the Old Testament laws, whereas, you know, someone in academia would say, yeah, it is. But
now, since we've established that ancient laws are not describing what is endorsed or condoned in regard to a particular behavior, what we have here is something of a bait and switch argument. Bowen is hoping, given the emotionally sensitive nature of the subject, that people won't look too closely at the contention that's being made. Well, what's the bait here? Well, of course, it's the topic of rape. What's the switch? It's the claim that laws, which are something of a historical misnomer, are endorsing a behavior rather than presenting a scenario and a potential resolution where a situation can be resolved in pursuit of societal harmony. But let's continue.
Disconnect is because, you know, the apologist is saying, well, the Bible is not calling that rape, which in one sense is a really important thing to recognize, right? If we're looking at what it is that they consider to be X. But in this particular discussion, generally speaking, the more important thing is, I guess in the apologetics discussion, I think it's far more common for the more important thing to be what we would consider to be X. And the reason for that is that the apologist then has to defend something that they know to be, or they believe themselves to be immoral, as they define it when seen in the...
No. Now, speaking apologetically, what would I have to defend? In this particular instance, I have to defend against the claim that rape is endorsed or condoned in the Bible. But that's not the claim that I'm making. Bowen is the one making that claim. Bowen is the one who has to demonstrate that X is not only rape as we would understand it, but he also has to provide a coherent justification for the claim that rape is immoral to begin with. Christians can do this. Atheists, agnostics, anyone who denies the Christian worldview is at a sincere disadvantage for making moral claims, automatically, without question. But let's continue.
I just want to, like, people are losing their minds right now about someone saying that David raped Bathsheba. I'm like, right. Yes, he did. And that is different from laws that say, this is how you sell your daughter into slavery to a man who's going to use her for sex. But those second parts aren't said in the laws, right? I mean, there are two different things going on. and they're both happening, and they're both related to this issue of sex, and they thought about it differently than we do, right? I don't know. Is that a helpful piece of what you're...
First of all, David did not rape Bathsheba. I've got an entire paper, this one right here, that I'll have linked below in the description. But yes, sex was thought of differently in the ancient world because relationships were largely structured around how one maintains their honor status in the community, which is something we need to keep in mind. And it's especially relevant because actually Dan McClellan starts to interject some things here that I think are important and we need to listen to.
Go ahead, Dan. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to add that I think our concept of a person and rights and things like that is also phenomenally distinct from how they conceptualize personhood anciently. Even today, we understand that there are phases of personhood and degrees of personhood, but anciently it was quite a bit different. Women weren't granted full personhood, legal, moral personhood that we would recognize today. And really, the men were the main possessors of that personhood. And so the consent of a woman in a sexual encounter isn't even on the table. It doesn't even compute anciently. It would be like asking how they felt about the Denver Broncos anciently. It doesn't compute. There's no framework for that. And so for people who say, well, to argue about who's consenting, who's not, who's seeking consent, it wasn't even a question. It did not matter what a woman thought. And so they may not have thought of that as a violation of her autonomy or her agency or her consent. And for us today to say, well, today, that's what we call sexual assault, sexual violence, rape, all of these things. And I think one of the knots, and we'll get into this more in the apologetics portion of this discussion, but one of the knots that apologetics require people tie themselves into is bridging the gap between that's how they thought about it anciently, this is how we think about it today, but at the same time, the person governing all this is supposed to be unchanging and eternal and have the same position irrespective, unless we get into ideas of accommodationism, and there we go, getting into
all right. So yes, that's important. We need to be careful. We need to think about who we are culturally. Yes, we do think about personhood very differently than people in the ancient world did. We, Westerners, we're individualists. We see human worth, dignity, value, authority nested into the individual person. The ancient person saw their dignity, their value, their authority nested in how they related to others. This is important because most people in even modern Asia, Africa, the Middle East, even parts of Central and South America today, this is still how they conceive of things. This is how they see themselves as persons because they're largely collectivist or dyadic. That is, their sense of identity is derived from relationships, not individual. Now, it is a different way of seeing oneself because it means you see your worth only as you relate to others within your particular social connection, which is primarily derived from kinship alliance and involves the promotion of group norms. The patriarch holds authority over the rights and privileges of everyone in the family. Now, this type of social arrangement can best be understood as role-based, and every person's rights are understood to exist within the boundaries of their role in relation to their superior and others in their hierarchy, depending on where they stand inside of a particular social circle that they're operating in. So, while in our culture, a woman has exclusive authority over her life, in the culture of the ancient Near East, she only has relative authority. And we'll probably get into more of this as we go along. But in the meantime, let's continue in the video.
And so I think it's important that we distinguish these ideas about personhood. And yeah, they didn't even, when Moses conquers, I haven't read this chapter in a while, the Ammonites, and they say all the women who have known a man, kill them. All the women who have not yet known a man, take them, keep them for yourselves. That's pretty clearly going to result in this sex slavery These are conquered peoples, people taken in battle, and so they fit perfectly into what you were allowed to take as property. So they were more property than person, and so they had no agency to be considered.
Okay, and what's wrong with that? I'm not saying it's good or that it's even moral. I'm simply asking for someone to explain in concepts that these people could understand why taking conquered people as slaves is wrong, morally speaking. Now, I don't doubt that there's anyone in this group who could articulate the coherent moral reasoning as to why it's wrong. They appeal to this thing called agency. But what does possessing agency have to do with how one treats their prisoners? This is what happens when you just assume your moral conclusions without having to think through them. Moving along.
Yeah, and I think that like the Deuteronomy 22 thing is really the prime example of that, where it actually, I was like, Deuteronomy 20, is it 20, 28 and 29 or somewhere in Deuteronomy 22, it outlines literally what you do when a man finds a virgin, rapes her, and then has decreased her value, so she's no longer a commodity that can be sold. He just has to pay father.
Yeah.
And then he marries the virgin, or the no longer virgin, I guess. And then he I think he can't divorce her either, right? It's like, so I mean, you end up with this situation where it's like, it doesn't say she becomes your sex slave for life, but what it says is that like she has the value of a certain amount of silver that you have to pay the father, and so like it endorses rape and slavery in my opinion in that text. Like it's saying, well, you know, rape happens, just take her as your sex slave.
Because what
all right, I don't mean to cut her off, but we got to talk about Deuteronomy 22, 28 to 29, because this is what this passage is about. If a man encounters a young woman, a virgin who is not engaged, and takes hold of her and rapes her, and they are discovered, the man who raped her is to give the young woman's father 50 silver shekels, and she will become his wife because he violated her. He cannot divorce her as long as he lives. Now, what's interesting is that almost no one had a problem with this passage until the 20th century that I can find. And it's mostly because there's one word that appears almost exclusively in modern English translations. What word is that? You guessed it, the word raped. Well, why is that? Because it's primarily an English translation that everyone has used since the New International Version was produced. And every other English translation didn't have this word in there. Well, why is that important? Well, let's take the King James Version, for example. It translates the term neutrally. If a man finds a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed, and lay hold on her, and lie with her, and they be found, when the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he hath humbled her, he may not put her away all his days. So the term that gets translated as raped in most English translations, in the King James, it's translated neutrally. Lie with her. It's translated simply. This is the direct, literal translation of the Hebrew. Now, we can argue whether or not the phrase lay hold on her contextually implies force. And indeed, the verb that gets translated lay hold of her is often used in military contexts, and it's used often in terms of siege warfare. An example of this is Deuteronomy 20:19, which is another interesting passage, by the way, and Joshua 8:8. But it's also used in Genesis 4:21 to describe harp players, specifically their skill. So perhaps we shouldn't just be looking at Deuteronomy 22, 28 to 30 in a vacuum by itself. Perhaps we should be looking at it in terms of its parallel passage, which is Exodus 22, 16 and 17, which reads, If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged and he sleeps with her, he must certainly pay the bridal price for her to be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must pay an amount in silver equal to the bridal price for virgins. What's interesting is that no one seems to have a problem with this passage, even though it is contextually and topically identical to the passage from Deuteronomy in regard to what it's discussing. In fact, it gets ignored, even though it uses the same verb in the same tense that gets translated as raped in Deuteronomy 22. Why is that? Is it because the translators are being inconsistent, or because we're simply ignorant of the sexual politics of the ancient world? Such as the fact there were a number of different marital strategies that were available and practiced in the ancient world, one of which the passage in Deuteronomy is attempting to address. Hold on. Don't lose your shit just yet. If you want to find out more about that, I'd advise you to check out Bruce Malina's book, The New Testament World, which has an entire discussion on the subject of marital strategies in the ancient world. But we also need to keep in mind the fact that in the culture of the ancient Near East, the father is the central authority who determines who has access to his daughters, and what is implied by this text is that either the woman or the man is attempting to circumvent that particular authority. Now, what does this mean in regard to Dr. Monger's assertion that, in his opinion, this constitutes rape and slavery? Well, it just literally means he's talking out of his butt. Opinions are like armpits. Everybody's got a couple, and they stink.
What woman doesn't want to marry her rapist? You know,
right. It's a pretty good way to ensure that you get the woman that you want. I think from the perspective of a man, right? Well, all you have to do is just rape her,
and it's not even really a punishment. Like it's not criminalizing the act.
No.
It's saying in the interest of social order, so that this person is not now outcast in society, left adrift.
Yep.
You just need to take care of them. And so it's like, hey, if you're going to do this, be aware that these are the consequences. And it's not
do it right.
Yeah.
And if anybody, just very quickly, and Kip, but if anybody's actually concerned that what we're saying here about, for example, Deuteronomy 22 is not accurate or is not consensus, I mean, obviously there are lots and lots of places that you could read, but I have an entire chapter dedicated to just rape and adultery in the ancient Near East and in the Hebrew Bible in the legal sections. And there's an extensive bibliography, and it's very heavily footnoted. So like I deal with all of that. And again, it's just, this is the consensus view.
Yeah.
So I noticed someone.
Now, what I noticed in these discussions is that no one ever bothers to bring up Deuteronomy 22, 23 to 27, which is what actually deals with rape. Well, why is that? Well, in regard to Bowen's contention in volume 2 of his Atheist Handbook of the Old Testament, what he demonstrates is that Deuteronomy 22, 28, and 29 fits within the cultural understanding of the ancient Near East when he writes, "It is considered a crime against the father, not against the daughter. The different penalties are paid to benefit the father and not the daughter. The father is considered to be the victim. The penalty for the rapist is far less severe because the offense could effectively be eliminated by the rapist marrying the victim." Now, when we consider this statement, especially in terms of the original cultural context, that is, that the father holds the ultimate authority over the lives of those in his household, this makes sense. It's not that the daughter isn't wronged, but that in terms of the cultural context, the wrong that is done is communicated up towards her social superior, the father, or the closest male relative, whatever the case may be, has to deal with this situation. But what we need to remember is that these aren't prescriptive laws. They're intended to convey how a situation could be resolved, given the assumptions of the culture. I mean, there are a lot of assumptions operating here. But the fact that Bowen admits that these acts are considered crimes, even though who is considered to be the actual victim is different, this is not endorsing the behavior. Now, in this next section, Dr. Kip Davis brings up a topic that has only recently become a topic of discussion. So let's listen in.
Someone raised a question in the chat when I glanced at it about, I mean, we've been talking about this, about the Bible's position on marital rape. And it's important to point out that, yeah, it's as Dan said, like, this is not even a concept that enters their worldview, like, on any level. But also important to point out is that this is not a concept that really entered any social discussion until, really tragically, very, very recently.
Yeah, I was gonna say 30,
right?
40.
Well, it's not even in some people's discussions.
Yeah,
like,
there are still people on Twitter saying marital rape is not a thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's been legislated that way. Yeah.
Now, there's a obvious problem with this way of thinking. The problem has to do with the fact that we don't necessarily have a consistent definition of rape, either in modern terms or in ancient terms. For example, when we look up what these terms mean, Psych Central, for example, renders it as rape is forcing or manipulating another person into unwanted sexual intercourse. Now, the problem with this definition is the question of unwanted becomes incredibly fluid. Is there a time when you may not want to do something, but it could be proper or even expected? Moreover, is manipulating someone to do something good necessarily bad? Sometimes you need to cajole people to do what's right or proper. So this question has problems. This definition has problems. Now, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, or RAIN, has a little more precise definition of the term. Marital rape is the term used to describe sexual acts committed without a wife's consent and or against her will by the woman's husband. He may use physical force, threats of force to her or another person, or implied harm based on prior assaults, causing the woman to fear that physical harm will be used if she resists. Now, RAIN directly associates marital rape within the context of other abusive behaviors. And they cite a number of studies where approximately half of all the abused spouses also report being raped by their abuser. So it seems to go part and parcel, as it were, with other incidences of intimate partner violence. So the primary issue here is that marital relationship, by its nature, has certain expectations within it. So when you attempt to import standards that are outside of the relationship into it, it can become very difficult to navigate them. Now, the assumption here is simply because the biblical text is silent on a particular subject, or it doesn't use our particular language for our situation, that it has nothing to say about it. Or if it speaks about it awkwardly, given a limited vocabulary, that it's wrong. Well, that's not only wrong, it's ignorant. Well, how can I demonstrate this? By referring to a text that just absolutely infuriates moderns. Ephesians 5. Specifically, Ephesians 5:25-31. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Husbands are to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hates his own flesh, but provides and cares for it. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So, anyone who abuses his wife in any way, mentally, emotionally, physically, sexually. He's sinning not only against her, but he's sinning against himself. Let's move along.
I just have to point out too, the big thing for me is that this text that, like, if you take the perspective that the writers of the Bible were people living in their time, great, fine, totally cool. It gets a little trickier when you say that these were instructions from an all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe that doesn't change. That's when all of a sudden it's like, well, how dare we change society's standards? Like, they'll say, oh, you're being woke. What's wrong to be anti-marital rape? So I think it's important to kind of draw out that the difference there is, and Ben Shapiro likes to say this, the difference is it's not that slavery was kind of everywhere. First, it wasn't. There were different cultures that didn't have slavery at the time, like the Jains he mentions, and Aboriginal Australians didn't necessarily have slavery. But it's that we're also led to believe by these same people that these were instructions from God.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. Namely, how do you know that the standards of your society are correct? I mean, if you're going to make a moral complaint, what is your basis for lodging this complaint? Regardless of whether it's rape, slavery, whatever. Show it to me. If you can't articulate the grounds in a logically coherent manner, then perhaps you need to sit down. Be quiet. Just shut up. Is that harsh? Maybe. But unless you can tell me something is wrong, why something is wrong, unless you can tell me why something is wrong, you're just wasting my time and the time of every other person in the room. And if God is God, yes, how dare you challenge him, and how dare you accuse him of doing anything wrong, and how dare you set up such a blatant straw man.
And if I could, because then maybe you can talk about another aspect of it, but I think it's important. We've sort of talked about some of the rape aspects of slavery and the Numbers 31 aspect, but there are very clear slavery laws that stipulate what we're describing here. So, and it's often missed, I think, in just a cursory reading. So if you look at Exodus 21, 2-6, you have the laws about the male debt slave. First of all, it's missed that the woman that he marries and their children are chattel slaves, and they remain that way. People miss that all the time. But what is his use? And this is really critical. Women are not the only ones that become sex slaves. He is being used even as a debt slave, even as an Israelite debt slave. He's being used for a sexual capacity because he's being used to
breed more
aid
slaves.
in breeding slaves, houseborn slaves. Yeah. But I think more dastardly, I suppose, when you look at verses 7 through 11, this is the Amah, this is the female slave that is being sold into concubinage. And again, like, there is, as everybody's been pointing out here, like, there is no concern for what her opinion on the matter is, but the way that she is being used is sexually, be it for reproductive purposes or just for sexual gratification. But I mean, these are very clear examples in the legal sections that are specifically dealing with slaves that describe this sort of sexual slavery.
Yeah. Okay. What's wrong with that? I hear a lot of statements of fact. This is the situation, this is the outcome. But I'm not hearing any actually articulated reasoning for why it's wrong. Hearing a lot of assumptions, but no moral reasoning. But so you hear where I'm coming from. Let's look at the text. Exodus 21, 2-4. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he is to serve for 6 years. Then in the 7th, he is to leave as a free man without paying anything. If he arrives alone, he is to leave alone. If he arrives with a wife, his wife is to leave with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children belong to her master, and the man must leave her alone. Now, here's the issue that Dr. Bowen is raising. It has to do with this last part here. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children belong to her master, and the man must leave alone. Now, here's something you won't hear talked about in these discussions. In the ancient world, there was a practice, and it was called hospitality. In the culture of the ancient Near East, and even in parts of the world today, there are strict rules that govern the hosting of guests in the ancient Near East. This person being described as a Hebrew, is someone who fits within the established culture. He's not necessarily a stranger, so he gets special accommodation. One of those accommodations could even include a woman. Now, most English translations actually kind of obscure the word here because they translate the Hebrew word for woman as wife. But the implication here is that she's given as an act of hospitality. In the ancient Near East, this could even be the host's own wife or even his concubine. The question is, what does one do, given the cultural expectations, deal with any potential outcomes, i.e., children? Well, if the man doesn't desire to have any relationship with the woman and any resulting children, how are they to be treated? They're rejected by their father, and so they're cut off from society unless the woman's master, here again, the Hebrew is being very generic in its terminology, just refers to anyone who has social responsibility over her, takes responsibility for the children and the woman. If the man wants to maintain the relationship, guess what? The next few verses after this passage specifically outline a formal adoption procedure where the man joins himself to the house in which the woman and her children are already attached. But here's something people miss, probably because they don't actually read their Bibles. We have an example of this. It's found in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, specifically in verse 34, where we're told of an Israelite by the name of Sheshan, who has only daughters. So he gives one of his daughters to his servant, and they have a son together, which Sheshan adopts as his own son, so he'll have an heir. Now, what Bowen is doing here is ignoring the underlying concerns of a culture which has different social structures and hierarchies, and assuming that he's in a position to morally judge them, but not providing any grounds to do so. So think about that as we continue.
I think there's an interesting difference to note between Exodus 21's treatment of the female slave and Deuteronomy's treatment. And I think what Exodus is kind of trying to do is, once the woman sells herself into slavery, she's obviously tainted goods from then on. If she's released after 6 years, there's not really much that she can do within the structure of their society at the time. She can't really go and find a valid marriage or anything like that, which suggests the point of buying a female slave is obviously fundamentally sexual in nature. But then Deuteronomy changes that. And I've been curious. You've done a lot more research on this than I have. Josh, what's the thinking on what the point of Deuteronomy's revision of this law might be?
I mean, it's debated. It's debated whether it is, and I tend to think that it is revising for that reason, just because of the way the syntax is. But it's debated whether this is talking about just a general service female slave, someone that's being used for labor, but not for her sexual capacities. So she's not being taken into concubinage. I mean, there are people that make the argument. But I mean, the way that it's placed, it's like, the law is set out, and then it says the end, and you'll also do this for your female slaves, which seems sort of, tacked on-ish.
Yeah, an afterthought.
Yeah, so...
And I don't remember if it's been explicitly stated, but the difference is, according to Exodus, a female slave does not get released after 6 years, but is permanent. Whereas in Deuteronomy, it does say your male and your female slaves after 6 years. And laws of Hammurabi were quite a bit more just, putting it at 3 years, I believe. Is that accurate? Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
All right. Again, here's where understanding that depending on the time in which a particular law is assumed to be in effect, and again, I use the term law here very loosely, depends on the particular marital strategy that is in operation. And I've mentioned this earlier, but in his book, The New Testament World, Bruce Malina explains that there are three primary strategies that get employed. Kind of cross culturally, we see these in action. And they kind of it depends a lot on how the society is set up. So what are these strategies? The first strategy is called the conciliatory strategy. It is primarily seen in the patriarchal period. It is defined by a perception that a woman is essentially an extension of a man's honor. As such, a woman is seen as a means to an end. This strategy can even be employed by women who do not have social access to get what they want. For example, this is how Judah is tricked by his daughter-in-law into fulfilling his vow. This is the period is marked by high incidences of both polygamy and polygyny. Now, the second strategy is called the aggressive strategy. It's primarily seen in the national period of Israel. It is defined by a reluctance to marry one's daughters outside of their particular clan or tribe, and it is marked by the gaining of daughters-in-law and the retention of family honor. Simply put, it's a numbers game, with women serving as the scorecard. Again, the strategy employs a lot of polygamy and polygyny, and it's defining. This is the defining aspect of it, and it's a general strategy of the majority of the ancient world, and it even extends into certain modern Eastern cultures in parts of Asia and the Middle East to this day. The last strategy that we need to think about is called the defensive strategy. This strategy is employed primarily in the post-exilic period of Israel. It grows out of a desire to preserve a culture. The defining characteristic of this particular strategy is its insistence on monogamy. It's a strategy that's marked by a concern for sexual exclusivity. That means that it exhibits a resistance to marital plurality, either in terms of serial monogamy, having multiple wives in a series, or polygamy. And it's specifically opposed to licentious behavior on the part of both spouses. Moreover, it's defined by an exclusive heterosexual direction. Interestingly, though, this strategy is more likely to assume the equality of the sexes, and it's also why it's so exclusive in its parameters. Now, if we were to put these into modern terms, we could say that the conciliatory strategy believes that marriage is to be non-exclusive, it's open. The aggressive strategy is female-only exclusivity, meaning that the female alone is expected to have an exclusive sexual partner. While in the defensive strategy, it's one of mutual exclusivity. The sexual partners are to be exclusive to one another. Now, what does this have to do with sex slavery? Which one of these strategies eliminates it completely, without exception? Was the defensive strategy. And why is this? Well, the instant that you begin to move away from an insistence that not only in a relationship that's based on sexual exclusivity,
Son of a
the instant that you begin to move away from an insistence not only on a relationship based on sexual exclusivity, but also mutual exclusivity, you immediately open the door to abuses. The instant that you say you have a right to have sex with anyone that you want to, whenever you want it, you necessarily create a market where abuse can not only exist, but proliferate. Right now, as I'm speaking, there are men, women, children. They're enslaved. They're being trafficked for the purposes of sex. Now, here's my challenge to these scholars. What's wrong with that? To what are you going to appeal to say that there's anything wrong with that? What's unjust about it? See, that's ultimately the question. They want to say that a 3-year term of service is more just than a 7-year term of service. The problem with that is it assumes what I pointed out way at the beginning of this discussion, that the laws are prescriptive rather than descriptive of expectations, but not necessarily requirements. Something we need to remember as we go along.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
The thing that I see, I went through, like I said, we made 29 pages of apologetic claims. I lost years of my life making that thing. But I will say that what apologists will often say, and we can get into this in the apologetic section, which will be the funnest part, I think, is they'll say, well, it never said that they would have sex with the little girls that they took as plumbers. Like it's, and it never says that, and it never says, as someone pointed out on Twitter, it never says that that the woman was chattel slavery. It just says that she's not to go with the husband. She's still got to serve out her 7 years. What would you say to someone who says that?
Me or anybody?
I don't know. Yeah, I guess.
It just doesn't
You've got
say
the
that.
con,
I think right away.
I mean, it's just
one
like
of the things that I would point out, and then Josh can continue. But my instant pushback on these sorts of claims is I think the critical thing to recognize here is there was no protection against these sorts of things happening.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to say something that's probably surprising here. I'm going to agree with Dr. Davis's statement, but not for the reasons that they think. There were no protections. There were no limits. And this is where I'm going to fault most apologists here. But I'm not going to take it completely away from them. I am going to argue that everyone, both the apologist and these people in this forum, they're wrong, and they're wrong for the exact same reasons. That reason is called anachronism. We assume that the biblical authors, or even the characters or situations being described in the Bible, assume anything that we believe right now, right here in this present time. There's a problem with that. Westerners, especially white Westerners, on this panel are operating on 2,000 years of developed and articulated Christian moral philosophy. That's the reason why I question their moral indignation about anything the Bible says or any position that they take. I mean, really, I do appreciate David's concern, but what justifies it? If he's going to say there's anything wrong with the Israelites taking sex slaves, assuming that's what they did, he has to prove it. See, as a Christian, I have to believe this. I have to believe this whole thing. I have to believe everything it says in its entirety. And that includes telling me factually what people did, when they did it. Moreover, it makes it incumbent on me to understand their mindset. What did they believe? Guess what? I accept the fact that the Israelites coming out of Egypt didn't have the book of Genesis. They didn't have its proclamation of the fundamental equality of humanity when it says that men and women both bear the image of God. I can accept that. I can accept the fact that revelation occurred over time and in time. Because that means I have to recognize that in man's rebellion in the garden, man was not only cut off from God by his rebellion, but that mankind hurtled headlong into it. That means part of that rebellion was manifested in the evils that slavery, as an institution, can allow to exist. I can accept the fact that God took time to reform his people. I can take time to understand that Israel had to grow. I can accept the fact that there's sometimes deafening silence on specific issues because God expects us to take what he's given us, both reason and conscience, and do good with it. Hard to believe it, but it's true. Moving on.
Yeah, and I mean, in Numbers 31, first of all, sick flex, bruh, right? Like, I mean, read the passage and it says, like, guess what they are? They're numbered as plunder, right? So here are the cattle, and here's how many women you get, right? And we have to make sure we set aside a certain number of those for this other tribe. It's like, so really, this is what you want to say about it?
Right.
Yeah. And this is what I don't get about these so-called scholars, is they assume they're in any position whatsoever to judge anything that's happened in the past, especially in any instance where the text is simply recording a historical event. Now, of course, what they won't tell you about Numbers 31 is that it marks the end of a series of events that begins way back in Numbers 22 with the Moabite king by the name of Balak, who conspires to kill the nation of Israel by hiring a diviner by the name of Balaam to curse the nation. And when Balaam is unable to curse it, Balaam suggests the Moabites just invite the Israelites to join in some local festivities in an attempt to incite Yahweh against them. Strange how these people have no problem with that, but they have a problem with Israel avenging itself on those who would have brought a curse on them. Sick flex indeed.
But the other thing that you were talking about, and this is sort of a Paul Copan-y sort of thing to do. It's become an adjective now, Paul Copan. Or I guess it'd be an adverb. No, the adjective, and that's anyway. I will do it called panely. Would be the adverb, but is like, oh well, what's the guy going to do in Exodus 21:2-6? So just very, very quickly for everybody, the law is saying here's the main law is if a male slave gets sold as an Israelite or sells himself as a debt slave, he serves for 6 years. That takes care of the entirety of his debt, whatever it is, interest, room and board, whatever. It's all taken care of. He gets set free, no debt. Then it says, well, what do you do if he came in single? He leaves single. If he comes in married to somebody, he leaves married to that person. Like they all go out, right? So however you come in, that's how you go out. But then the question comes up, well, what happens if the master gives him a wife during that 6-year term of service? And the law is explicit that the woman and any children that they produce together are the property of the master. Well, Paul Copan comes up to this and says, well, like, what do we make of this? Well, I mean, certainly it can't be what it says, right?
Yeah.
Right? So let's put on our thinking caps and see what we can come up with.
In other words, Paul Copan, in chapter 13 of his book Is God a Moral Monster, is trying to be consistent. He's trying not to project our assumptions backwards into history, avoiding the fallacy of anachronism. And again, here's where having in mind those marriage strategies that I talked about earlier, running around in our head, can help us mentally visualize. It can help us structure exactly what's going on in this situation. And the first mistake, and this is where I will have to fault Copan in his discussion of Exodus 21 is that, again, we assume when the word that often gets translated as wife means what we think of as wife, rather than woman or sexual partner. Let's remember, because I already mentioned that in the ancient Near East, the culture had this defined sense of hospitality that's being worked out here. We can't read our 2,000 years of developed, heavily Christian assumptions backwards into a situation that existed 3,000 years ago. But Bowen's attempted ridicule of Copan here is really sad, and it's historically and anthropologically inept. Copan is simply attempting to think like an ancient Israelite in trying to resolve this situation. Now, here's the thing. I'm not saying that you have to like it or that you have to agree with it, but you do have to accept there's a fundamental reality that is underlying what's going on, and you have to be willing to accept it, at least in logical terms.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So let's put on our thinking caps and see what we can come up with. Sorry, that's not nice, but I mean, that's how it comes across, Paul. Sorry.
Ironic.
Ironic that the guy he's ridiculing is the only one who's calling on people to actually think.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So let's put on our thinking caps and see what we can come up with. Sorry, that's not nice, but I mean, that's how it comes across, Paul. Sorry. And he says, like, well, maybe the husband can go out and he can like save up his shekels and maybe like, buy her freedom, or maybe, but the thing is, well, maybe he could just wait out the rest of her contract. Well, the problem is there is no contract.
First of all, Dr. Bowen, how do you know that there isn't a contract? And second, even if there isn't, how do you know that the man couldn't buy them out? Now, what's interesting is that the text, and I have to keep repeating myself at some of these points, does give us a potential resolution. The man gets adopted into the family. I know that's stunning to even bother to consider, but it's a solution to the problem, assuming that there's a problem to begin with.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So let's put on our thinking caps and see what we can come up with. Sorry, that's not nice, but I mean, that's how it comes across, Paul. Sorry. And he says, like, well, maybe the husband can go out and he can like save up his shekels and maybe like, buy her freedom, or maybe, but the thing is, well, maybe he could just wait out the rest of her contract. Well, the problem is there is no contract.
Now, what's funny here, I know I've repeated this clip a couple of times here, but I want it to be kind of running in our heads. But what's funny here is that Bowen wants to appeal to the ancient Near Eastern context and then totally ignore it in the process. After all, what does Copan say when he's discussing this passage? Before coming up with a modern Western solutions to solve ancient Near Eastern problems, we should make greater efforts to better grasp the nature of Israelite servitude and the social and economic circumstances surrounding it. Now, that's the only thing that I would change about this, is to say we always have to look at situations in terms of their historical context. Not merely in terms of actions, but of expectations. Because it's only here that anyone can make any kind of judgment about a situation. It's called charity. Perhaps people should try it. Now, why am I so insistent on this? First, it allows me to deal with any text, biblical, any historical text, in its historical context. And here's where what we see in the text, historically speaking, especially when we look at passages like in Exodus and Deuteronomy, at least in my opinion, given my reading on this subject, is that Exodus tends to represent a nomadic to semi-nomadic way of life, that it's full of varying situations and requires a lot of nuance to navigate, while Deuteronomy represents a more settled and situated life. Both represent types of perceived ideals in regard to their particular circumstances. But that's the Old Testament. What happens when we get to the New Testament period? Now, this next clip is rather long, but I want us to listen to it. And when we go through it, I have some comments and we'll kind of wrap things up. It's something Dr. Bird says, and it occurs at about the hour 40-minute mark of the video. So let's just listen in.
So can I take this back, because I think there's a sort of the elephant in the room here, that's probably going to be the most important question that people are going to ask about this particular section of the discussion.
You mean why I didn't refer to the directives to slaves?
No. I was thinking of something even more.
Okay.
So Kip and I just did a debate a couple of months ago, and one of the apologetics that, again, we'll get into later, but I think it's important to talk about it here, is that, well, yeah, Old Testament slavery, bad, but like God is working with mankind, condescending. But by the time you get to the New Testament in the early church, it's condemned. So slavery is condemned. So in the context of what you just gave, that little chuckle tells me what your answer is going to be. I have a section on this in the Atheist Handbook, the Old Testament, but like, Dr. Bird, you're the expert. So what is your reaction to that apologetic argument?
I think my reaction is, historically speaking, slavery was a part of the world that, let's just go to these people, whether or not they're historically accurate, that Jesus lived in, that Paul lived in. It was a part of their world. And there is nothing in the Newer Testament that directly challenges that reality. In fact, we have commands to enslaved peoples to be good slaves. We have, the parts I skipped over because it was so obvious. I just wanted to talk about the other parts. So, right. I would invite this person to consider, what does it tell you that Paul uses rhetoric that comes out of enslavement scenarios to talk to the people in these various parts of the world, of the Greek and Roman context? Like, what does that tell you about whether or not God is condemning this institution, if Jesus is using the language of this institution to talk to people? Jesus is telling stories that hold up abuse of humans and not in any kind of a way saying this is a terrible thing. What does that say to you? Can you process that? And I have to be honest, it took me a bit to get there, because even at my stage of academic pursuit, it was still hard for me to actually acknowledge that Jesus tells these parables that are where he's holding up the abuse of enslaved peoples as something to emulate, or as a threat, so people will behave a particular way. But those two stories of the unforgiving enslaved person, and the one of the Matthew 25, the foolish and wise young women, like those two stories in and of themselves, to me, say that Jesus also wasn't there to denounce the institution of slavery. He's not saying anything bad about it.
Now, first thing I need to say here is that I agree with Dr. Bird. Slavery is simply a reality of the world of the writers of the New Testament. And so the writers speak into that particular reality. Why did they do that? Because what they were saying had to make sense to their immediate audience. You speak to people where they are and in terms that they can understand. And this goes back to something that Dr. McClellan brought out, and I believe it's the matter of accommodation. Now, what does that term mean? The simplest way I can think to explain accommodation is that you're trying to explain something to a 5-year-old. A few months ago, I had a conversation with an atheist philosopher by the name of Alex Malpass, and it was on the topic of original sin. And in that conversation, I used a number of analogies to try to explain what I meant by not only original sin, but by its effects on humanity. Now, most of the people most of the people who were listening in the conversation, I was watching the comments, they seemed to be confused by the analogy, the sheer number of analogies I was using, and how they would say, "Well, this seems to contradict." But I hope that somewhere in that audience, someone got it, and it stuck. And I hope that the Holy Spirit began to use it. And in that conversation, I was trying to relate I was trying to communicate a very complex, multidimensional topic to a varied audience that I had no idea who they were, what their backgrounds were, where they were religiously speaking. Now, how might the most complex being in existence communicate with us? Well, he's going to speak in terms that we can understand. Jesus, the apostles, they spoke to their audiences in terms that they could understand. Now, what does it mean for Paul speaking to a group of people using their language and rhetoric of their socio-cultural realities mean? Well, it means that Paul knew and understood his audience. And I think there's two ways to understand that. I'm not saying that there couldn't be more, but I think there's at least two. The first is anchored in a kind of stoic philosophical understanding. You can't change your circumstances, but you can change how you respond to them. Here's the reality. You're a slave. What can you do about it? Well, you could run away, but in all likelihood, you would be captured and tortured and possibly die. You can be miserable in your position as a slave, and likely means you'll be beaten, tortured, possibly killed. Or you could be a good slave. You can accept your circumstances and possibly live a long life. Which one of these options is most appealing? Well, what's the second? It simply asks the question, who's really in charge? God or your master? If it's your master, then you're simply subject to his will. Doesn't matter what you do or what happens. However, if God is ultimately in charge, then you're in this position because God has put you there. And the only option that you have as God's servant is to serve where he's put you. Now, the question is, how do you get from one position where slavery is the norm to another where slavery is rejected? I think it's a very complex, nuanced, has to be really thought through. But there's a passage I think we need to look to that kind of gets us into Paul's mindset. And it doesn't get brought into these discussions because it's kind of buried in a different context. And that passage is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 17 to 24. But each one lived his life in the situation the Lord assigned when God called him. This is what I command in all the churches. Was anyone already circumcised when he was called? He should not undo his circumcision. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? He he should not get circumcised. Circumcision does not matter, and uncircumcision does not matter. Keeping God's commands is what matters. Let each of you remain in the situation which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Don't let it concern you. But if you can become free, by all means take the opportunity. For he who is called by the Lord as a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who is called as a freedman is Christ's slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of people. Brothers and sisters, each person is to remain with God in the situation in which he was called. Now, how does this passage help us think about Dr. Bird's question? And here's where I think the late Kenneth Bailey can give us some insight from his cultural commentary on 1 Corinthians, which is titled Paul Through Mediterranean Eyes. 4 times in the New Testament, slaves, servants, are told to obey their masters. Ephesians 6:5, 1 Timothy 6:1-2, Titus 2:9, 1 Peter 2:18. Paul's dealing with slavery can be easily misunderstood. The church under Stalin in Russia had very few public options. Having lived most of my adult life as part of the Arabic-speaking Christian community in the Middle East, I know that they also have a number of limited public options. For more than a millennium, they have lived out their faithfulness in the midst of a sea of Islam. Public criticism of the Islamic social, political, and economic foundations of the state has never been a possibility for them. In the first century, preaching in the catacombs by the light of an oil lamp was one thing. There they could speak freely. Circulating a written document was something else. Into whose hands might it fall? Russian Christians under Stalin had one public option: obey the state. Any other option was suicide. Any book or paper written and published by Christians in Russia during that period carried with it special risks. Paul could not, in writing, attack the institution of slavery and survive. The best option for a slave in that society was to obey the master. Failure to do so would have brought on crucifixion. In this critical passage, Paul pushes the envelope as far as he can. You see, from what I hear from these scholars, all that I hear from them are complaints from insulated, privileged, historically and culturally isolated white Westerners. More than likely, the only place they've ever lived is in Western society, which is politically free, economically stable, and socially mobile. They've never had to live in a culture where they can be persecuted if they break rank. These scholars are ignorant. They're mad that God didn't inspire Scripture to speak to them specifically, where they are, when they are, in terms they would understand and recognize. Instead, God chose to speak to those in a different land with strange customs and strange languages. In my opinion, these people wasted money on their degrees because they clearly didn't learn anything, or if they did, then they're lying to their audiences. So, how do we get from a society that not only accepted slavery as simply a reality to one that not only rejects it, but recognizes it as evil? Very simply, the gospel of Jesus Christ. The status of slave and the institution of slavery became an analogy for man trapped in sin, who's subject to the whims and passions and suffering the repercussions for his actions. With the coming of Christ and the proclamation of freedom from sin, the impetus for removing the vestiges of immorality and sin, which slavery often represented, became a focus, and eventually slavery was removed. Now, we look at history, and the unfortunate reality of history is it took a long time for slavery, at least in the Christian context, to even not only become a concern, but to become unthinkable. There's no doubt in that. In fact, Christians readily accommodated themselves to the practice of slavery, both as slaves and as slave owners. And there was no obvious requirement for someone to free their slaves. In fact, for most part, there seems to be no overall concern with the institution. Now, that's not to say that there weren't those who weren't concerned about the treatment of slaves, though you do have to do some careful study of some of their arguments and really think through them. But the general consensus of Christians, even into the 5th, 6th century, was that slavery existed as a memorial to the reality of the fall. The simple fact of the matter is Christianity was largely neutral to many social situations, unless there was something particular that was unjustified in it. Because most of these institutions were just simply ingrained social realities, and it was essentially left up to the conscience of individual Christians, and the occasional head would pop up and voice rejection and opposition. But herein lies the question, and it's the question that I'm going to end on. And it's simply something of a teaser, because it's something you're going to see when you look at this question historically. If you're going to argue with something is wrong with the world, to what are you going to appeal in order to support that contention? Well, what are you going to appeal to? If you're going to reject what Scripture says about the world, about the fall, about the reality of man's fallen nature as a result of Adam's sin, what's the problem? What's wrong with anything that happened in the ancient world? Anybody? What's wrong with anything that happens today? Anything that you're going to complain about in the world, you're appealing to something. What are you appealing to? Anyway, I'm Triggerman 1976. Be sure and check out the description below for links to articles that I've written on much of what's been covered in this video. That being said, so long for now. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, and above all, God bless.